The moment I revealed I still held the deed to their dream farmhouse after being told I wasn't welcome at my son's 25th anniversary celebration, his wife's crystal wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering against their imported Italian tiles. My name is Margaret Collins, and for over 30 years I had quietly maintained ownership of the property they believed was theirs, while my children thought it had been transferred to them decades ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph was taken almost 30 years ago. Me at 43, standing with my son William, just 20 years old then, in front of the old Peterson farmhouse that had been in my late husband's family for generations. We were celebrating William's upcoming graduation before he would leave for his first corporate job in the city. The farmhouse had been my husband's childhood home, where I'd spent the happiest years of my marriage, and where I'd hoped our children and grandchildren would create their own memories. The worry in my eyes contrasts with the excitement on William's face. He was eager to begin his new life, too young to understand the promises his father had asked me to keep before passing away just 2 years earlier. The farmhouse, with its weathered red barn and sprawling apple orchards, wasn't just property. It was living history, the embodiment of values that seemed increasingly rare in our fast-paced world. This land tells our family story. My husband James had told William countless times while teaching him to prune the heritage apple trees that had sustained 4 generations. Remember, appearance changes with seasons, but roots determine what endures. Never forget what truly matters, even when shiny distractions try to convince you otherwise. Those words would prove prophetic decades later, in ways none of us could have anticipated. I married James Collins when I was just 22, a small-town librarian with a passion for preserving history who fell in love with a third-generation apple farmer. Our wedding was modest, but meaningful, held under the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the orchard. I can still remember the scent of apple blossoms mixing with wildflowers as we exchanged vows surrounded by friends and neighbors who had known the Collins family for generations. James was different from the other young men in Mapleton. Where they saw limitations in small-town life, he saw purpose and connection. "Every apple we grow feeds someone's family," he'd say, his hands calloused but gentle. "There's honor in that kind of work, Maggie, even if it doesn't make headlines." Our son William was born 3 years later, followed by our daughter Catherine, 2 years after that. Those early years were filled with the rhythms of farm life, harvests and plantings, county fairs and community suppers. James and I raised our children amidst the orchards, teaching them the value of patience, hard work, and stewardship of the land. But by the time William reached high school, I could see James's values struggling to take root in our son. The world was changing rapidly in the 1990s. Technology was transforming industries, and globalization was making our small farming community seem increasingly isolated. William began spending less time in the orchards and more time dreaming of city skylines and corporate success. "There's nothing for me here, Mom," he told me during his senior year, as we sat on the farmhouse porch watching sunset paint the orchard in golden hues. "Dad doesn't understand. The future isn't in family farms anymore." James tried to hide his disappointment, continuing to share stories about our land's history and the sustainable farming practices his grandfather had pioneered. But I could see the growing distance between father and son, a generational divide widening with each passing season. When James was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer during William's sophomore year of college, everything changed. The prognosis was grim, 6 months at most. William came home immediately, temporarily setting aside his business studies and internship plans to be with his father. Those final months revealed a different side of my husband. Despite his weakening body, James's mind remained sharp, focused on ensuring his legacy would continue beyond his lifetime. One evening, as I sat beside his hospital bed, He squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you about the farm." He explained that he had been watching William closely during his visits home. "He's not ready, Maggie. If he inherits the farm now with his current values and priorities, he'll sell it to developers within 5 years." I protested initially, wanting to believe better of our son, but James was insistent. "It's not his fault. We raised him in one world, but he's heading into another. Someday he might understand what this land really means. But not yet. Not until he's lived enough to see beyond the surface of things." That night, James outlined a plan that would shape the next 3 decades of our lives. He had already consulted with Edwin Porter, his lifelong friend and our family attorney. Instead of transferring the farm directly to William upon James's death as specified in his existing will, we would create a special trust arrangement. "On paper, it will appear that William inherits everything," James explained. "But legally, you'll maintain actual ownership through a separate trust. Ed will handle all the paperwork so it seems like a normal inheritance, but the transfer won't actually happen until certain conditions are met." The plan troubled me. "Isn't that deceptive?" I asked. James shook his head slowly. "It's protective. Maggie, of the land, yes, but ultimately of William too. I'm not trying to control him from the grave. I'm trying to give him time to grow into the kind of person who would truly value this inheritance." 2 weeks later, I sat in Ed Porter's office, signing documents that would create the illusion of transferred ownership while preserving my actual legal control. The arrangement was complex but ironclad. Documents showing William as the inheritor would be prominent and public, while the trust documents maintaining my ownership would remain private, known only to Ed and me. "This isn't about deception, Margaret," Ed assured me, echoing James's sentiments. "It's about preservation of both the land and the values it represents." James passed away peacefully 3 weeks later, surrounded by family. At the reading of the will, William appeared genuinely moved when Ed announced that the farmhouse and orchards would pass to him. Catherine, who had always been more interested in her teaching career than the farm, seemed relieved that her brother would shoulder the responsibility. "Your father believed in you, William," Ed said formally, handing over what appeared to be transfer documents. "He wanted you to be the steward of the Collins legacy." What William didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the documents were essentially ceremonial. The actual ownership remained securely in my name, held in the James Collins Preservation Trust. In the difficult years that followed, I watched as William graduated with honors and accepted a position with a prestigious financial firm in Chicago. He returned to Mapleton infrequently, always with the distracted air of someone who had outgrown their childhood surroundings. When he did visit, he would walk the property with the detached interest of a landlord rather than the loving attention of a steward. "You know, Mom," he said during one such visit, about 5 years after James's death, "we should consider selling at least part of the orchard. The eastern section would make excellent home sites. There's a developer who's been eyeing land in the area." I felt my heart constrict but maintained my composure. "Your father wanted this land kept intact, William. It's been in the family for generations." He looked at me with the pitying expression I was growing to resent, the look of someone who believed they understood the modern world while I remained trapped in the past. "Dad's thinking was outdated, Mom. These small family farms aren't sustainable anymore. The smart play is to liquidate assets while land values are high." "The farm pays for itself," I countered, which was true. I had hired the Peterson brothers, neighbor boys who had grown up learning from James, to manage the orchard operations. We weren't making a fortune, but the heritage apples had found a growing market among organic food enthusiasts and farm-to-table restaurants. William shook his head. "It's not about subsistence, Mom. It's about maximizing return on investment." Those words, return on investment, so foreign to the values James had lived by, told me everything I needed to know about the wisdom of my husband's foresight. I maintained the illusion over the years, allowing William to believe he owned the property, while making excuses whenever he suggested selling or developing portions of it. There are agricultural preservation clauses, I would explain, or the zoning commission has restrictions on development. Ed Porter helped craft these explanations, providing official-looking documentation when necessary. Meanwhile, I continued, living in the farmhouse, tending to James's beloved gardens, and working part-time at the Mapleton Historical Society. Catherine settled in Madison with her husband and children, visiting more frequently than William, but still viewing the farm, with the affection of nostalgia rather than active engagement. The real change began when William met Diane Harrington at a charity gala in Chicago. Elegant, ambitious, and from a wealthy Lake Forest family, Diane was everything William aspired to be associated with. Their courtship was brief and, from my perspective, strategic, two people recognizing the advantages of their union rather than being drawn together by deeper connection. When they married at the Harrington family's country club, I attended with mixed emotions. The celebration was lavish but impersonal, more networking event than family milestone. Diane's parents, Gerald and Eleanor Harrington, treated me with the polite condescension of people accustomed to assessing others by their net worth and social connections. "William tells us you still live on that charming little farm," Eleanor commented during the reception. "How quaint to maintain such traditions in today's world." After the wedding, William and Diane settled into a luxury penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. Their visits to Mapleton became increasingly rare and, when they did occur, increasingly uncomfortable. Diane made little effort to hide her disdain for the provincial surroundings, while William seemed embarrassed by the simplicity of his roots. "Mother, you really should consider updating this place," Diane suggested during one Christmas visit, eyeing the farmhouse's well-worn furniture and hand-braided rugs with thinly veiled disapproval. "We know an excellent designer who could bring it into this century." "I'm comfortable with things as they are," I replied simply. "Not everything improves with modernization." As the years passed, I watched William transform from the thoughtful, if ambitious, young man James had raised into someone who measured everything, and everyone, by their financial value and social utility. His career flourished, with promotions and bonuses that funded an increasingly luxurious lifestyle. But each success seemed to take him further from the values his father had tried to instill. When their first child, James, named after his grandfather, in what seemed more like branding than tribute, was born, I hoped that parenthood might reconnect William with deeper values. Instead, young James's upbringing became another project to optimize, with elite preschools, carefully selected activities, and a childhood scheduled for maximum achievement rather than discovery and joy. During their rare visits to the farm, I would try to share stories about their grandfather with young James and his sister Elizabeth, hoping to plant seeds that might someday bloom. Diane would invariably intervene, checking her watch and announcing it was time for the children's tennis lessons, or language tutoring, or whatever enrichment activity had been scheduled. "We need to maximize their potential during these formative years," she explained with the certainty of someone who had read all the right parenting books, but missed the deeper wisdom of simply loving children as they are. The first serious conflict arose when William was 45, having just been named partner at his firm. During a phone call that was ostensibly to share his good news, he casually mentioned that he was considering options for the farm. "A development group has approached me about creating an exclusive rural retreat community," he explained. "High-end, vacation homes for executives looking to escape the city. The offer is substantial, Mom." "The farm isn't for sale, William," I replied firmly. "Mom, be reasonable. That land is sitting there underutilized. The orchard barely breaks even, and the property taxes keep rising. It makes financial sense to capitalize on the asset." Not everything of value can be measured in dollars, I responded, channeling James's spirit. William sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Look, I understand the sentimental attachment, but at some point we have to be practical. I'm not suggesting selling all of it. You could keep the farmhouse and immediate grounds. This isn't up for discussion, I said, ending the conversation. 2 weeks later, Ed Porter called to inform me that William had contacted him about preparing sale documents for portions of the Collins property. Don't worry, Margaret, Ed assured me. I explained that there are complications with the title that would need to be resolved before any sale could proceed. That should buy us some time. This pattern repeated every few years. William would approach with increasingly lucrative development proposals, and I would find ways to defer or decline without revealing the truth about the ownership arrangement. Ed Porter, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, helped maintain the necessary legal fiction while preserving my actual control. The situation reached a critical turning point last spring, as William and Diane approached their 25th wedding anniversary. During a rare visit to Mapleton, they announced they were planning an elaborate celebration at the Harrington family's estate. It's going to be the event of the season, Diane explained, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she gestured expansively. We're flying in guests from across the country and even Europe. William's business associates, my family's connections, people who have been crucial to our success. I nodded politely, already anticipating the formal invitation that would soon arrive. William cleared his throat, exchanging a look with Diane that immediately put me on alert. About the anniversary celebration, Mom, he began, his tone shifting to what I recognized as his client management voice. We've been finalizing the guest list, and there's something we need to discuss. Diane took over, her practiced smile never reaching her eyes. The thing is, Margaret, the celebration has evolved into something of a strategic event for William's business relationships. The guest list includes several high-profile clients and potential partners who— She paused, seemingly searching for the right euphemism, who have certain expectations about the kind of gathering this will be. What Diane means, William interjected, is that the event has taken on a more formal, curated atmosphere than we initially planned. Given your comfort level with these types of social situations and the importance of these relationships to my firm's future, we thought, You're uninviting me to your anniversary celebration, I stated plainly, interrupting his careful circumlocution. William had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable before regaining his composure. Not uninviting, Mother. We're suggesting an alternative. We thought we could have a separate, more intimate dinner when we return, just the family, in a setting where everyone would be more comfortable. The implication was clear. I, with my sensible shoes, unfashionable clothes, and direct manner of speaking, would be an embarrassment among their sophisticated guests. My presence might diminish William's carefully cultivated image, or worse, remind him of the simple values and humble beginnings he had worked so hard to transcend. As I drove home that evening, a plan began to form in my mind. For nearly 30 years, I had maintained the illusion that William owned the family property, hoping that someday he would grow into the kind of person who truly deserved such an inheritance. But now, approaching my 75th birthday, I had to acknowledge a difficult truth. That day might never come. The farm that James had loved, that generations of Collins men had tended with reverence and care, was in danger of becoming nothing more than a real estate asset in William's portfolio, something to be carved up, developed, and monetized once I was no longer around to preserve it. The time had come for truth, not out of vengeance for being excluded from their celebration, but from the recognition that the values James and I had hoped to pass down were at risk of being lost forever. The following morning, I called Ed Porter and asked him to prepare documents that would fundamentally alter the arrangement James had established 3 decades earlier. When he heard what I intended, The old lawyer was silent for a long moment. "Are you certain, Margaret?" he finally asked. "This will change everything between you and William." "Everything has already changed, Ed," I replied. "I'm just finally acknowledging it." 2 weeks after my conversation with Ed Porter, I received an engraved ivory invitation to William and Diane's 25th anniversary celebration. Despite our previous discussion, they had still included me on their formal guest list, though a handwritten note from Diane made their expectations clear. "Margaret, we understand if you decide this type of event isn't quite your cup of tea. We're still planning that intimate family dinner for when we return." The elegant dismissal confirmed what I already knew. I was an inconvenient reminder of William's humble origins, an element that didn't fit the carefully curated image he and Diane had constructed. The invitation wasn't extended with any hope. I would accept, but rather to maintain appearances and perhaps assuage some lingering guilt. I placed the invitation on my kitchen table beside the folder Ed Porter had delivered the previous day. Inside were documents that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my son, papers revealing the truth about the farm's ownership and establishing new provisions for its future. For 30 years, I had maintained a fiction created out of love and hope. Now, approaching my 75th birthday, I had to accept that hope wasn't enough. Action was required to preserve what truly mattered. The following morning, I called William at his office, something I rarely did. His assistant initially tried to screen the call, but when I insisted it concerned an urgent legal matter regarding the farm property, she reluctantly put me through. "Mom?" William sounded surprised and slightly impatient. "I'm heading into a meeting. Can this wait until evening?" "I need to speak with you and Diane in person," I said firmly. "It's about the farm and some decisions I need to make before your anniversary celebration." His tone shifted to one of cautious interest. "Has something changed with the zoning restrictions?" "Because I've been speaking with a consultant who believes we could overcome those limitations if—" "This isn't about development possibilities, William," I interrupted. "This is something more fundamental that needs to be discussed face to face." After some negotiation, we settled on dinner at their penthouse the following weekend. The timing was deliberate on my part, close enough to their anniversary celebration that the connection between my exclusion and my decision would be clear, but with enough distance that my actions couldn't be dismissed as mere emotional reaction. Drive to Chicago that Saturday afternoon gave me time to reflect on the path that had brought us to this point. I remembered William as a child, helping James check the apple blossoms in spring, his small hand in his father's as they walked the orchard rows. I recalled his genuine interest in the farm's history, before ambition and external validation became his primary measures of worth. Somewhere along the way, that curious, connected boy had been buried beneath layers of achievement and acquisition. I wondered if he was truly happy in the life he had constructed, or if, in quiet moments, he ever felt the absence of something deeper that money couldn't buy. William and Diane's building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel overlooking Lake, Michigan, with a uniformed doorman who eyed my modest sedan with barely concealed disapproval as I pulled up to the valet stand. The penthouse itself was a testament to their success, expansive windows framing spectacular city views, museum-quality art adorning walls, and furniture that looked more sculptural than functional. "Mother, welcome," Diane greeted me with air. Kisses that carefully avoided actual contact. Her black cocktail dress and statement jewelry seemed excessive for a family dinner, creating another subtle reminder of the social divide between us. "William is just finishing some calls. Can I get you something to drink? Perhaps a sherry?" The antiquated drink suggestion, what she imagined a woman my age would prefer, was yet another small indication of how little she actually knew me. "Water is fine," I replied, taking a seat at their massive dining table, already set with fine china and crystal that would likely see more use tonight than in the average month. William emerged 15 minutes later, apologizing for the delay while glancing at his watch, a clear signal that this dinner had a predetermined endpoint. After perfunctory inquiries about my drive and health, he wasted no time addressing what he assumed was the purpose of my visit. "So, Mom, you mentioned something about the farm that couldn't wait. Has there been a problem with the property taxes or issues with the Peterson brothers' management?" I shook my head slightly, waiting as Diane served an elaborate first course that seemed designed to showcase her sophistication rather than provide nourishment. When we were all seated, I reached into my handbag and removed a manila envelope, placing it on the table beside my plate. "Before we discuss why I'm here, I'd like to ask you both a question," I began, noting how they exchanged a glance at my directness. "The anniversary celebration you're planning, why am I not welcome?" Diane's carefully composed expression flickered with momentary discomfort before she recovered. "Margaret, as we explained, it's not that you aren't welcome. It's simply that the nature of the event is not suited to someone like me," I finished, for her. "Someone who doesn't fit the image you want to project to your important connections." William set down his fork with a sigh that suggested I was being unreasonable. "Mother, this isn't personal. It's a matter of creating the right atmosphere for relationships that are crucial to my firm's future. Some of these clients and partners have certain expectations about the kind of event this will be. And your mother from the apple farm doesn't meet those expectations," I stated plainly. "You're twisting our words," Diane interjected, her tone carrying the practiced patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. "We're simply trying to ensure everyone is comfortable in their surroundings. We thought you might prefer a more intimate family gathering rather than such a formal, high-profile event." The pretense that this exclusion was for my benefit rather than theirs only deepened my resolve. I opened the manila envelope and removed the first document, a recent property assessment of the Collins farm, showing its current market value. "Did you know," I asked conversationally, "that with the expansion of bedroom communities and the growing interest in rural tourism, the farm is now worth nearly $8 million? William's expression sharpened with interest, exactly as I had anticipated. "That's considerably higher than the last valuation, which brings me back to why it makes financial sense to at least consider partial development." I held up my hand to stop him, then extracted the second document from my envelope. "This might interest you more," I said, sliding it across the polished table surface. William picked it up, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. It was a copy of the trust document James had established 30 years earlier, with the current ownership clearly indicated. "I don't understand," he said finally, looking up with confusion. "This shows that the farm is owned by something called the James Collins Preservation Trust, with you as the sole trustee and beneficiary. But that can't be right. Dad left the farm to me in his will." "No," I corrected gently. "You were shown documents that made it appear that way. Your father was concerned that you weren't ready to be the steward of his legacy. He hoped that someday you would grow into that responsibility, so we created an arrangement that would give you time to develop the values needed to truly care for the land." Diane, who had been reading over William's shoulder, looked up sharply. "Are you saying that William doesn't actually own the farm? That this has all been some kind of deception?" "I prefer to think of it as protection," I replied. "Protection of a legacy that 4 generations of Collins men built with their hands and hearts." William's face had drained of color as the implications sank in. "For 30 years, you've let me believe I owned property that was actually yours. Do you have any idea how many plans I've made, how many opportunities I've considered based on that assumption? Opportunities to sell off pieces of your heritage, you mean?" I asked quietly. "To develop the orchards that your great-grandfather planted?" "Yes, I'm well aware of those plans. That's precisely why your father established this arrangement." Diane's crystal wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the imported Italian marble floor. Neither of them moved to clean up the spill as she stared at me with undisguised shock. This isn't possible, William insisted, shuffling through the documents again as if searching for evidence that would disprove my claim. Dad would never have done this. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, I assured him. Ed Porter has maintained the legal structure flawlessly for 3 decades. Your father hoped that eventually you would come to value the farm for what it truly represents, not just for its potential financial return. The shock in William's expression was giving way to something harder, more calculating. This can be challenged legally, he said, his voice taking on the tone he used for business negotiations. Deception over decades, hidden assets, manipulation of inheritance. Any court would. The trust was created legally before your father's death, with his full knowledge and consent, I interrupted calmly. Ed Porter has maintained impeccable records for 30 years. He's now the senior partner at Porter, Jacobson and Reed. Your father was protecting his legacy, not deceiving his son. William stood abruptly, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering city below. When he turned back, his expression had hardened into something reminiscent of a courtroom adversary rather than a son speaking to his mother. Why now? He demanded. After 30 years of maintaining this charade, why reveal it now? The question hung in the air between us, bringing us to the heart of the matter. I removed the final document from my envelope, the new amendment to the trust that Ed Porter had prepared at my request. Because decisions need to be made about the future of the Collins farm, I said, placing the document on the table. For 3 decades, I've preserved your father's legacy, hoping you would eventually understand its true value. But I'm 75 years old now, William. I need to ensure that what James and his father and grandfather built isn't destroyed after I'm gone. William approached cautiously, as if the paper might bite. What kind of decisions? He asked, not yet reaching for the document. I've amended the trust, I explained. Upon my death, ownership of the Collins farm will transfer not to you, but to the Mapleton Agricultural Heritage Foundation. The silence that followed was profound. Diane remained frozen beside her shattered wineglass, while William stared at me as if seeing a stranger. You're disinheriting me, he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. I'm protecting. Something that 4 generations built, I corrected. Something that means more than its market value or development potential. William's expression darkened. Because I excluded you from an anniversary party? This is punishment, pure and simple. No. William, I replied with a sadness that surprised even me. This isn't about the party. It's about finally acknowledging what has become increasingly clear over decades, that you and I have fundamentally different values about what matters in life. If I'm not important enough to include in your celebration, perhaps your father's legacy isn't important enough to include in your future. That's manipulative, Diane interjected, finding her voice again. You're using this property to force yourself into our anniversary celebration. I turned to her with unexpected calm. I'm not forcing anything, Diane. I'm making decisions about property I've maintained for 30 years based on the values demonstrated by the people involved. You've made your choice about my place in your celebration. I've made mine about the future of my family's legacy. William picked up the amendment, scanning it with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to finding leverage in legal documents. His expression shifted slightly as he read further. There's a provision here, he said, looking up with narrowed eyes. The transfer to the foundation doesn't become irrevocable for 1 year from today. That's correct, I confirmed. Ed suggested that provision. It creates a window, a year in which perspectives might evolve and choices might be reconsidered. On both sides. A year to change our plans for the anniversary celebration, you mean? Diane clarified, her tone bitter. Or lose the property forever. A year to reflect on what family truly means, I corrected gently. I've preserved this farm for 30 years out of love for your father's vision, William. Not as a bargaining chip, but as a labor of devotion to something genuine and lasting. William returned to his chair, sitting heavily as the full implications sank in. "I need to process all this," he said, his voice strained. "Finding out my mother has secretly controlled property I thought I owned for decades, that my father essentially didn't trust me with my inheritance, that you're now threatening to donate it away. It's a lot to absorb at once." "Of course," I agreed, gathering my things and standing. "Take whatever time you need. The amendment is dated today, so the 1-year window has just begun. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that every acre of that farm, every tree in those orchards, has been maintained exactly as your father would have wanted, out of love for a family legacy I hoped would continue." As I moved toward the door, Diane remained beside the shattered wineglass, her carefully constructed plans now as fragmented as the crystal on her floor. William followed me to the foyer, his expression a complex mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been reluctant respect. "I never knew you had this in you, Mom," he said quietly, holding the door. "This level of strategic thinking." I paused, looking directly into the eyes of the son I had raised alone after James's death, seeing glimpses of the boy he had been beneath the man he had become. "There's a great deal you don't know about me, William," I replied with a sad smile. "Perhaps that's the real tragedy in all of this, that you never thought to ask." The drive home through darkened highways gave me time to process the confrontation. The look on William's face when he realized I still owned the farm would stay with me, not as a triumph, but as the moment when my son finally saw me as something more than the simple, unworldly mother he had constructed in his mind. Whether this revelation would lead to reconciliation or permanent estrangement remained uncertain. But for the first time in decades, our relationship would proceed from a place of truth rather than comfortable fictions, however painful that truth might be. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone chimed with a text message from Ed Porter. "How did it go?" I sat for a moment in the quiet car, considering how to summarize an encounter that had shattered 30 years of carefully maintained illusions. Finally, I typed, "The truth is out in the open now. So am I." The week following my revelation at William and Diane's penthouse passed in silence. No calls, no messages, just the hollow quiet of relationships in crisis. I moved through my days with outward calm, volunteering at the Mapleton Historical Society, tending to my garden in the by gentle spring sunshine, attending my weekly book club at the library. But inwardly, I questioned whether I had destroyed my relationship with my only son in my determination to be recognized and to protect James's legacy. Then, 8 days after our confrontation, a text message appeared from an unexpected source. "Margaret, this is Diane. I'd like to speak with you privately. Coffee tomorrow at the Riverfront Cafe in Mapleton, 10 a.m.? The message was so unexpected that I read it 3 times before responding with a simple agreement. What could Diane possibly want to discuss without William present? Was this a peace offering, or another attempt to negotiate my inclusion in their anniversary celebration under different terms? When I arrived at the cafe the following morning, I spotted Diane immediately at a corner table, dressed more casually than I had ever seen her in jeans and a simple blouse, her usual perfect makeup noticeably absent. The vulnerability in her expression was so unexpected that I momentarily hesitated before approaching. "Thank you for coming," she said as I took the seat across from her, her usual polished charm replaced by what appeared to be genuine uncertainty. "I know this is unexpected." "I'm curious why you wanted to meet," I acknowledged, studying her with interest. "William doesn't know I'm here," she said quickly, her fingers fidgeting with her coffee cup. "After what happened, we've been having some difficult conversations," I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "First, I want to apologize," she began, the words seeming to require visible effort. "Excluding you from our anniversary celebration through that manipulative lunch invitation was wrong. I should have pushed back when William suggested it would be cleaner if you weren't there." The directness of this admission surprised me. William specifically suggested I shouldn't attend? Diane nodded, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. He framed it as concern for your comfort, but looking back, I should have questioned his motives more thoroughly, especially now that I understand about the farm. She took a deep breath before continuing. The thing is, Margaret, I've been raised in a world where appearances matter above everything. My parents' entire social existence revolves around who's invited where, who sits at which table, which connections can be leveraged for advantage. When William raised concerns about potential awkwardness at the celebration, it triggered all my conditioning about social harmony trumping family connections. It was perhaps the most genuine thing I had ever heard her say. The carefully constructed facade had cracked, revealing something more complicated beneath. After you left that night, she continued, William and I had the first real fight of our marriage. He was angry about the farm, about being denied what he saw as his rightful inheritance. But when I suggested we could use the one-year window to simply include you in the celebration and secure the property, he became even more upset. This surprised me. He didn't want to reconsider the arrangements for the celebration? That's what shocked me too, Diane admitted. He said, this isn't about the damn party anymore. It's about the fact that my mother has been living a completely different life than I thought for 30 years. It's about the fact that the modest, simple woman I've been dismissing as naive and limited has been executing a sophisticated legal and financial strategy since before I entered the corporate world. Hearing my son's words quoted back to me created a complex emotional response, pain at his anger, but also a glimmer of hope that he was finally seeing me as a complete person rather than a convenient caricature. What happened then? I asked quietly. I asked him if he was more upset about being excluded from your secret or about not getting the property, Diane said, her eyes meeting mine directly. His answer, or rather his inability to answer immediately, made me realize I don't actually know the man I've been married to for 25 years as well as I thought I did. She paused, visibly struggling with whether to share something deeply personal. My father built his real estate empire by prioritizing business connections over family at every turn, she finally continued. My mother has spent 40 years arranging her entire existence around his preferences and social ambitions. When William couldn't immediately answer whether he valued you or the property more, I saw my parents' marriage reflected back at me, and it terrified me. The honesty of this confession created an unexpected opening between us, a brief moment of genuine human connection without the layers of social positioning that had characterized our previous interactions. The farm isn't just property to me, Diane, I explained gently. It's the physical embodiment of James's values, of sacrifice spanning generations. Every spring when I've walked those orchards alone while William was building his career in Chicago, I've maintained it with the hope that someday my grandchildren would know their grandfather through the land he loved. I understand that now, Diane said, surprising me again. After you left, I stayed up all night looking at the farm's records you brought. The care in every detail, the preservation of something authentic and meaningful. It's the opposite of the disposable luxury I've been raised to value. She hesitated, before adding, I think I want more of what you value in my life and less of what my parents taught me matters. This admission hung between us, creating a moment of unexpected connection. For the first time, I was seeing beyond the polished surface to the woman underneath, someone potentially more complex and thoughtful than I had given her credit for. I've made a decision, Diane continued after a pause. With or without William's agreement, I'm not having an anniversary celebration where his mother isn't welcome. I've already contacted the Harrington estate to cancel our reservation. Canceled. The celebration? I asked, alarmed that my actions had precipitated such a drastic response. Not the anniversary recognition, she clarified quickly. Just the elaborate event with all of William's business connections and my parents' social circle. If William still wants to celebrate our 25 years together, We'll need to create something different, something that honors authentic family connections rather than business opportunities. The courage this decision must have required impressed me. For someone raised in Diane's world, canceling an elaborate society event represented a genuine risk, potential social embarrassment, parental disappointment, commentary from their peers. How did William react to this decision? I asked, trying to gauge where my son stood in this unexpected development. I haven't told him yet, Diane admitted. That's partly why I wanted to see you first. Before I take such a definitive step, I needed to understand something. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. The trust amendment gives us a year before the farm transfers to the foundation. If we create a celebration that includes you, truly includes you, not as an afterthought but as William's mother deserves, would you consider reversing the amendment? The directness of the question took me by surprise. Is that why you're here? To negotiate for the property? 6 days ago it would have been, Diane admitted with unexpected candor. But something has changed in me since seeing those farm records, since understanding what 30 years of quiet preservation looks like compared to my parents' constant pursuit of the next status symbol. She pulled out her phone, showing me her screen. I've been researching the Mapleton Agricultural Heritage Foundation. Their mission to preserve working family farms and traditional agricultural practices aligns with environmental values I've actually held for years, but never prioritized. In my decisions, if you donate the farm, it would be protected forever, which has its own kind of beauty. This thoughtful consideration was so far from the Diane, I thought I knew that I found myself reevaluating my assumptions about her character. What I'm trying to say, she continued, visibly struggling to articulate complex emotions, is that I'm not here to negotiate for the property. I'm here because I want a different kind of relationship with my mother-in-law than my mother has with her in-laws. I want to understand the woman who loved something enough to protect it quietly for 30 years without needing credit or recognition. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever I had expected from this meeting, it wasn't this moment of genuine connection with the woman I had assumed would never understand my values. The anniversary celebration was always more William's vision than ours anyway, Diane added with a wry smile that suggested newfound self-awareness. All those business connections, the strategic seating arrangements, the calculated networking opportunities. It was like planning a corporate merger rather than celebrating a marriage. I couldn't help but smile at this assessment, which precisely captured my impression of the event they had been planning. And what would your vision be if you were creating a celebration based on your actual values? The question seemed to catch her off guard, as though no one had ever asked what she truly wanted, rather than what was expected. After a moment's reflection, she answered with surprising simplicity. Something intimate and authentic. Somewhere beautiful and natural, with only people who genuinely care about us as individuals, not as networking opportunities. Her eyes took on a distant quality as she envisioned something different from the elaborate performance they had been planning. Maybe even somewhere like the farm, she continued softly. Under those ancient apple trees at sunset, with simple food served family style at long tables. The kind of gathering where people actually connect rather than distribute business cards. The image she painted was so contrary to the sophisticated socialite I had believed her to be that I found myself wondering how much of Diane's persona had been constructed to meet expectations rather than express her authentic self. That sounds lovely, I said sincerely, and vastly different from what you've been planning. I know, she acknowledged with a self-deprecating laugh. If you'd told me 2 weeks ago I'd be canceling a luxury celebration at my parents' estate in favor of something simple under apple trees, I wouldn't have believed it. But seeing those farm records, understanding what 30 years of quiet dedication looks like, it made me question everything about what I've been taught to value. We talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more naturally than I would have thought possible. Diane shared stories about her childhood in a family where appearances always trumped authenticity. where her mother's genuine interests were systematically subordinated to her father's social ambitions. I found myself recognizing patterns that paralleled William's gradual transformation from James's thoughtful son to a man who measured success primarily in acquisitions and appearances. "What happens now?" I asked, as our meeting drew to a close. "Have you spoken with William about any of this?" "Not yet," Diane admitted. "We've been circling each other cautiously since your revelation. He's been speaking with his father's old attorney friends almost daily, which concerns me given what we now know about the farm situation. They'll be encouraging him to challenge the trust amendment legally," I observed, understanding the probable strategy of the corporate lawyers William associated with. Diane nodded. "Almost certainly. But I think there's something else happening too. William has spent his entire adult life trying to build a career that would impress his colleagues and clients. Your revelation has created the first serious crack in that foundation. He's questioning things he's accepted as truth for decades." As we prepared to leave, Diane hesitated before asking one final question. "Would you be willing to show me the farm?" "Not William yet. Just me. I want to understand what you've preserved before I try to help him see its value." The request was unexpected but felt genuine. "Yes," I agreed after a moment's consideration. "I think that would be a good first step." As we parted ways outside the cafe, Diane surprised me with a brief but sincere hug. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, "and for maintaining that farm all these years. Whatever happens with the trust amendment, I'm grateful to understand the kind of woman my children might have as a grandmother someday." The comment caught me off guard. This was the first mention of my potential role in their children's lives, a future I had begun to fear might never include me. The thought that Diane was considering my place in their family suggested a shift in perspective I hadn't dared hope for after the exclusion from their celebration. Driving home, I reflected on how completely this meeting had upended my assumptions about Diane. I had cast her as the villain in my narrative, the status-climbing wife who viewed me as an inconvenient reminder of William's less sophisticated origins. The reality appeared far more complex. A woman who had been raised in a world of appearance over substance, but who might be more capable of growth and self-reflection than I had given her credit for. Whether this unexpected alliance would lead to genuine reconciliation with William remained uncertain. But for the first time since the anniversary celebration exclusion, I felt a glimmer of hope that something authentic might emerge from the painful truths now exposed. 3 days after my coffee with Diane, I drove to the farm with her beside me in the passenger seat. The journey felt symbolic, crossing the distance between my carefully hidden past and an uncertain future. Diane had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the drive, watching the urban landscape gradually give way to rolling countryside, and finally the familiar rural roads of Mapleton County. "It's beautiful here," she observed as we turned onto the gravel drive leading to the farmhouse. "So different from the manicured country club properties my parents preferred." "James chose this location deliberately," I explained, navigating the familiar curves with practiced ease. "He wanted somewhere that felt connected to nature's rhythms, somewhere that required you to adapt to the seasons rather than bending everything to human preferences." As we rounded the final bend and the farmhouse came into view, I heard Diane's soft intake of breath. The afternoon sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the weathered red barn and white clapboard farmhouse. The heritage apple orchard stretched across gently rolling hills behind the main buildings, their orderly rows creating a living patchwork against the landscape. "The photographs didn't do it justice," Diane murmured as we parked. "It feels sacred somehow." The word choice surprised me. Sacred was not a term I would have expected from the pragmatic, status-conscious woman I had assumed Diane to be. Yet it perfectly captured what this place had meant to my family across generations. As I unlocked the farmhouse door, I felt a momentary hesitation. For 30 years, this space had been my private sanctuary, the one place where I maintained complete connection to James and the values we had shared. Allowing Diane inside represented a level of vulnerability I hadn't anticipated when agreeing to this visit. James's grandfather built most of this with his own hands, I explained as we stepped into the main room with its exposed beams and riverstone fireplace. He was a builder by trade, but this place was his masterpiece, created for family rather than clients. Diane moved through the space with unexpected reverence, her fingers lightly tracing the hand-carved details on the mantelpiece, her eyes taking in the built-in bookshelves filled with well-worn classics and agricultural references that had guided 4 generations of Collins men. "You can feel the intention in everything," she observed quietly. "Nothing is random or carelessly chosen." I nodded, unexpectedly moved by her perception. That was James's philosophy. He believed that spaces shape how we live within them, that a thoughtfully created home encourages thoughtful living. We continued through the farmhouse with me sharing stories connected to different spaces. The kitchen where James's mother had taught me to make her famous apple butter. The window seat where I had read stories to William when he was small. The back porch where James and I had spent countless evenings watching sunset paint the orchards in gold and amber. When we reached the small bedroom that had been William's during his childhood summers, Diane paused at the bookshelf still lined with adventure novels and field guides from his youth. "He never mentioned any of this," she said, lifting a worn copy of The Call of the Wild that had been William's favorite at 12. "The way he talks about his childhood, I assumed there were no happy memories from before college." "There were many happy times," I corrected gently. "But I think when William chose to align himself with corporate values and status markers, it became easier to minimize those memories rather than reconcile them with the path he had chosen." Diane replaced the book carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It's as though he created a narrative where his real life began when he entered the business world, and everything before that was just prologue." "Exactly," I agreed, struck by the insight. "And in that narrative, I became a supporting character rather than a full person with my own story." We ended our tour in the orchards, walking between rows of apple trees that James's grandfather had first planted nearly 70 years ago. Some varieties were so rare that they existed in only a handful of heritage orchards across the country, living history preserved through decades of careful stewardship. "These are Roxbury russets," I explained, pausing beneath a gnarled but still productive tree, one of America's oldest apple varieties, first grown in Massachusetts in the 1600s. Almost disappeared entirely during the commercialization of apple farming, when markets began demanding perfect-looking, uniform fruit. Diane ran her hand gently along the tree's rough bark. "But this one survived, because someone cared enough to preserve what others thought had no commercial value," I said quietly. "James's grandfather understood that some things deserve protection simply because they're authentic, not because they're profitable." We sat on a weathered bench at the orchard's edge as afternoon transitioned toward evening, golden light filtering through the ancient trees. In the distance, a pair of red-tailed hawks circled lazily above the fields, their calls echoing across the quiet landscape. "I understand now," Diane said finally, breaking a comfortable silence. "Why you preserved this place, why it matters so much. It's not just property, it's the physical embodiment of your family's values and history." "Yes," I confirmed, grateful for her understanding. Every tree, every board represents James's belief that creating something of lasting quality matters more than momentary convenience or passing trends. Diane turned to face me directly, her expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I need to tell you something. After our coffee meeting, I went to see Gerald Harrington." This admission caught me completely off guard. "Your father? Why?" I needed to understand his perspective on marriage and family, she explained, to hear directly from him why appearances and status have always trumped authenticity and connection in our family. The thought of Diane confronting her intimidating father, a man whose real estate empire and social connections had shaped Chicago's development for decades. Both concerned and impressed me. "What did he say?" I asked carefully. "At first, he was dismissive," Diane began, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "He tried to explain that social positioning is simply how the world works, that maintaining certain standards is necessary for business success. But when I pressed him about whether he had any regrets about prioritizing business connections over family moments, something unexpected happened." She paused, seeming to replay the conversation in her mind. "He got very quiet, then asked what had prompted these questions. I told him about the farm, about how you had preserved something authentic for 30 years without recognition or credit. His response surprised me. He said, 'Some people have the courage to choose what truly matters. I always told myself I'd make that choice eventually, but eventually never came.'" The glimpse into Gerald Harrington's regrets created an unexpected connection to this man I had only known as a formidable figure at William and Diane's wedding. "What happened then?" I asked. "I told him that I'm canceling the anniversary celebration at their estate," Diane continued. "That I want something more authentic, with only people who genuinely care about us." I expected anger or at least disappointment, but instead he just nodded and said, "Your mother will be upset, but I think I understand." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the orchard, Diane asked one final question. "Will you show the farm to William? I think seeing it through adult eyes, understanding what you've preserved all these years, might help him reconnect with values he's forgotten." "If he's willing to see it," I agreed. "This place has always been here, waiting for him to remember what matters." The drive back to the city was companionable, filled with conversation about the farm's history and Diane's growing interest in heritage agriculture. As I dropped her at their building, she embraced me with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Margaret," she said quietly, "for showing me there's another way to measure what matters." 3 days passed with no word from William. I tried to focus on my routine, volunteering at the Historical Society, tending the farmhouse garden, meeting with my book club, but found myself checking my phone with increasing frequency, hoping for some indication that Diane had succeeded in reaching through to my son. On the 4th day, as evening approached, a text message appeared. "Mom, it's William. Can we talk? I'm outside your house." My heart raced as I looked through the front window. Sure enough, William's black luxury sedan was parked at the curb, and he sat inside, seemingly gathering his thoughts before approaching the door. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and opened the door before he could knock. "William," I said, simply, my voice steadier than I felt. He stood on my porch looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his normally perfect appearance showing signs of strain, tie loosened, hair slightly rumpled, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the confident authority I had grown accustomed to hearing. I stepped aside wordlessly, allowing him into the modest home where he had grown up, but now rarely visited. He entered the living room and stood awkwardly, his gaze moving around the familiar space as though seeing it through new eyes, noting the hand-braided rug James's mother had made, the bookshelf his grandfather had built, the watercolor of the farm hanging above the fireplace. "Diane told me she visited the farm with you," he began, his eyes still moving around the room as though cataloging previously unnoticed details. "She did," I replied. "She seemed to appreciate it." "She described it differently than I remembered," William said slowly. "More significant. Said it helped her understand you better, that there was more to the story than either of us had recognized." I gestured toward the sofa, and we both sat, maintaining a careful distance between us. This was the closest we had been physically since the confrontational dinner, where I had revealed my decades-long secret. "I've been meeting with Dad's old law partners," William continued after a moment. They believe we have grounds to challenge the trust amendment based on the deception during the inheritance process. Though the word stung, I wasn't surprised. I expected as much. That's what I wanted to do initially, he admitted. I was angry, furious, really, that you had hidden this from me for decades, that you were using it as leverage regarding the anniversary celebration. I started to object to this characterization, but he held up his hand. Please, let me finish. That's how I saw it at first. But something Diane said after visiting the farm made me stop and reconsider everything. What was that? I asked, curious, about what insight could have penetrated the narrative his legal advisors were undoubtedly constructing. She asked me a simple question. Why did your mother maintain that farm perfectly for 30 years if she never intended for you to have it? It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of the matter, revealing Diane's emotional intelligence in a way that surprised me. I didn't have a good answer, William continued. Dad's attorneys kept talking about hidden assets and legal technicalities, but they couldn't explain why you would preserve a family property for 30 years, only to change the inheritance plan now. It didn't align with the narrative they were creating about your motives. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. So I started asking different questions, not about the legal aspects, but about you, about the mother I thought I knew, versus the woman who had executed a sophisticated legal strategy and maintained a valuable property for decades without anyone knowing. This shift in perspective, from seeing me as a legal adversary to recognizing me as a complex person with my own narrative, represented the first step toward what I had most wanted. True recognition of my full humanity beyond the limited role he had assigned me in his life story. Dad's attorneys couldn't answer those questions, William admitted, a hint of wonder in his voice. Or wouldn't. They kept steering the conversation back to property values and legal strategies. But Diane, he smiled slightly, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him in our conversation. Diane refused to let it go. She kept pushing me to consider your perspective, to try to understand why preserving that farm mattered enough for you to maintain the secret for decades. And what conclusions did you reach? I asked carefully. William met my eyes directly for the first time. That I never really knew you at all. That I accepted a narrative about you, about your capabilities, your financial acumen, your values, without ever questioning if it was accurate. That I reduced you to a convenient character in my life story, rather than recognizing you as the author of your own. The acknowledgement was so precisely what I had longed to hear that I found myself momentarily speechless. After decades of being underestimated and dismissed, having my son recognize the fundamental mischaracterization felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. I want to see the farm, William said into the silence. Not with development potential in mind, or legal challenges, but to understand what you've preserved all these years. To understand what it meant to Dad, what it means to you. I would like that, I replied simply, recognizing the courage it had taken for him to make this request despite the undoubted opposition of his legal advisors. There's something else, he continued, his expression growing more serious. After talking with Diane, after really thinking about what excluding you from our anniversary celebration represented, we've decided to cancel the plans at my in-laws' estate entirely. This news, while not entirely unexpected after my conversations with Diane, still surprised me coming from William. Are you postponing the celebration? Not postponing, he clarified. Reimagining. Diane and I have been having some very honest conversations about what matters to us, about starting the next 25 years of our marriage with authentic values rather than social performance. He hesitated before adding, We were wondering, that is, Diane suggested, would it be possible to have our anniversary celebration at the farm? Under the apple trees, with the sunset over the orchard, in a place built with genuine care rather, than a venue chosen for its exclusivity? The request caught me completely off guard. From being excluded from their elaborate society event to having them request the farm as their venue represented such a dramatic reversal that I found myself momentarily overwhelmed. "You want to celebrate at the farm?" I clarified, wanting to be certain I understood correctly. William nodded, a vulnerability in his expression I hadn't seen since he was young. "If we're going to mark this milestone in our life together, it should be somewhere with meaning and history, not somewhere chosen to impress people we barely know." "What about your business connections?" I couldn't help asking, remembering his justifications for excluding me. "The networking opportunities you mentioned were so important to your future?" William's expression hardened briefly before softening into something that looked like regret. The partners at the firm were disappointed, to put it mildly. "Several have made it clear that declining to include them represents a missed opportunity for my career advancement." He shook his head slightly. "But Diane helped me see that building our relationship on authentic connections matters more than cultivating strategic business opportunities." This shift in perspective, prioritizing genuine relationships over strategic advantage, represented such a departure from the values William had absorbed in the corporate world that I found myself wondering what other conversations had transpired between him and Diane. "The farm would be perfect for your celebration," I said finally, meaning it wholeheartedly. "Your father would have been so pleased to see it used for such a meaningful gathering." "There's something else I need to ask," William continued, his expression growing serious again. "About the trust amendment donating the property to the foundation." I nodded, having anticipated this question. "The amendment isn't irrevocable yet. There's still the 1-year window during which it could be modified or rescinded." "I'm not asking you to change it," William said, surprising me yet again. "At least, not right away. I think I need to earn back the right to inherit that legacy, to demonstrate that I understand and value what it represents, not just as property, but as the embodiment of family values worth preserving." This recognition that the farm represented more than a financial asset was precisely what I had hoped might eventually emerge from our confrontation. That William had reached this understanding so quickly, despite the undoubted contrary advice from his legal team, suggested a depth of character I had begun to fear had been completely overshadowed by corporate values. "What are you proposing?" I asked, curious about how he envisioned moving forward. "First, I'd like us to visit the farm together," he said thoughtfully. "For me to see it through adult eyes, to understand what you've preserved all these years. Then, if you're willing, I'd like to learn from you about Grandpa's building techniques, about Dad's sustainable farming practices, about the maintenance you've done, about the history embedded in every corner of that place. The idea of sharing the farm with William, not just as a piece of property, but as the repository of family history and values, created a surge of emotion I hadn't expected. For decades, I had maintained that space alone, preserving memories and craftsmanship without anyone to appreciate the effort or understand its significance. "I would like that very much," I said softly. "And about the anniversary celebration," William continued, seeming encouraged by my response. "We're thinking something small in late summer, when the apple trees are beginning to fruit, and the evening light on the orchard is at its most beautiful. Just family and our closest friends, people who know us as we really are, not as we present ourselves professionally." The vision he described was so far from the elaborate social performance they had been planning that I marveled at the transformation in their thinking. Something about the farm, or perhaps Diane's perception of what it represented, had catalyzed a fundamental shift in their approach to marking this milestone in their marriage. "That sounds lovely," I said sincerely, "though I imagine your in-laws might have other opinions about such a significant change in plans." William's expression confirmed my suspicion. "Gerald was surprisingly supportive, actually. Said something about choices he wished he'd made differently. Eleanor is adjusting to the idea, though she suggested we could at least host a separate reception at their country club for their social circle." He smiled slightly before adding, Diane was surprisingly firm in refusing. She told them we're starting the next chapter of our marriage by being true to ourselves, not by performing for strategic advantage. This glimpse of Diane standing up to her formidable parents, something that had intimidated far more experienced individuals, reinforced my growing appreciation for her character beyond the polished social facade I had initially judged. "And your firm?" I asked, knowing the corporate world William inhabited could be unforgiving of what might be perceived as social missteps. "Some of the partners are disappointed," he acknowledged. "Others seem to respect the choice to prioritize family values. Either way, I'm finding I care less about their opinions than I would have a month ago." As our conversation continued into the evening, I felt the careful distance between us gradually diminishing. William asked questions about my life that he had never thought to ask before, about my work with the Historical Society, about the books that had shaped my thinking, about the financial decisions I had made raising him alone after James's death for perhaps the first time in our adult relationship. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding me as a complete person rather than the simplified character he had constructed in his mind. Though reconciliation would require more than a single conversation, this opening represented the essential first step, recognition of my full humanity beyond the limited role he had assigned me in his narrative. As William prepared to leave, he paused at the door, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally offered, the words clearly difficult for him. Not just about the anniversary celebration, but about never really seeing you. About accepting a narrative about your capabilities and values without ever questioning it. About dismissing your wisdom and perspective without ever trying to understand them. The apology, unexpected and clearly genuine, created a lump in my throat. "Thank you," I managed, recognizing the courage it had taken him to acknowledge these failures of perception. "Next weekend," he said as he stepped onto the porch. "If it works for you, Diane and I would like to visit the farm to begin learning about what you've preserved all these years." "Next weekend would be perfect," I agreed, feeling a cautious optimism I hadn't expected to experience so soon after our confrontation. As I watched his car disappear down the street, I reflected on how completely the dynamic had shifted in just 2 weeks, from being excluded from my son's anniversary celebration to having them request the farm as their venue, from being dismissed as financially naive to having my decades of strategic preservation acknowledged. The transformation was remarkable in its speed and scope. Whether this represented lasting change or a temporary reaction to the shock of my revelation remained to be seen. But for the first time since discovering I had been uninvited from their celebration, I felt genuine hope that something authentic might be salvaged from the painful truths now exposed. The weekend visit to the farm marked the beginning of a gradual but profound transformation in my relationship with William. As we explored the property together, him seeing it through adult eyes, me sharing stories I had never thought he would be interested in hearing, I watched him reconnect with memories that had been submerged beneath years of corporate conditioning. "Remember this," he said, running his fingers along the ancient oak table in the dining room. "Dad used to spread out seed catalogs here every January, planning the season's crops. Your grandfather built this table from a tree that fell during a storm in 1943, I explained, touched that he recalled these details. James believed that good stewardship meant finding purpose in what others might see as destruction. William nodded thoughtfully. A different philosophy than what I learned in business school. There, it was always about maximizing gain, minimizing loss, not finding meaning in the process. This simple observation, contrasting his grandfather's values with corporate principles, suggested a growing awareness of the different moral frameworks that had shaped his life. Throughout the weekend, similar moments of recognition occurred as William rediscovered aspects of his childhood that had been minimized in the narrative he had constructed as an adult. What surprised me most was Diane's genuine enthusiasm for the farm's simple authenticity. Far from the status-conscious socialite I had assumed her to be, she showed a deep appreciation for the craftsmanship and intention evident in every corner. You can feel the difference between something built to impress versus something built to endure, she observed, comparing the solid oak table to the trendy but already deteriorating furniture in their penthouse. We've been spending thousands on pieces that won't last a decade, while this table has survived generations of use and still looks beautiful. The weekend concluded with a sunset walk through the orchards, the three of us sharing a comfortable silence as golden light transformed the trees into living sculpture. As we prepared to return to the city, William surprised me by asking a question I never expected. "Would you teach me, Mom, about maintaining the farm, about the skills Grandpa and Dad used to keep it thriving? I realize I know nothing about preserving something valuable across generations." The request represented more than practical knowledge transfer. It acknowledged the wisdom embedded in my decades of careful preservation, wisdom he had previously dismissed as irrelevant to his sophisticated modern life. "I would be honored," I replied, meaning it wholeheartedly. Over the following months, as summer progressed, toward their planned September anniversary celebration, William and I established a new weekly ritual. Every Saturday we would work together at the farm, with me teaching him aspects of maintenance and stewardship that had been my solitary responsibility for 30 years. How to check the foundation for signs of settling, how to properly clean and preserve the hand-hewn beams, how to prune the heritage apple trees for optimal health rather than maximum production. "I never realized how much knowledge is required to preserve something properly," he admitted during one such lesson. "I assumed maintenance was just about hiring professionals when needed, not about intimate understanding of materials and natural cycles. That's the difference between owning something and being its steward," I explained. "Ownership is a legal concept. Stewardship is a relationship that requires knowledge, attention, and care." These philosophical discussions became as important as the practical skills I was teaching. Through them, William began to understand that the farm represented not just property, but a value system, one that prioritized quality over quantity, durability over fashion, substance over appearance. Parallel to these weekend lessons, another unexpected development unfolded. Rather than maintaining the professional distance that had characterized our relationship for years, William began calling me regularly, often to discuss tensions arising in his career. "The senior partners are still pushing me to reconsider canceling the high-profile celebration," he confided during one such call. "They keep framing it as a missed opportunity to solidify client relationships that could advance the firm's interests." "How are you handling that pressure?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response to what would have once been a compelling argument. "Better than I would have 3 months ago," he admitted. "I'm starting to recognize when they're framing personal interests as business necessities. The distinction wasn't clear to me before. This growing discernment, the ability to distinguish between corporate priorities and his own values, represented significant emotional maturation. William was developing what James would have called root judgment, the capacity to maintain his own principles while remaining in relationship with those who held different values. Diane underwent her own parallel transformation. As anniversary plans progressed, she gradually distanced herself from her parents' social expectations, choosing authenticity over appearance in ways that surprised even William. She told her mother's interior designer friend that "we don't want anniversary gifts from their registry." William reported with a mixture of amusement and admiration that we'd prefer contributions to the Mapleton Agricultural Heritage Foundation instead, since protecting working farms matters more to us than accumulating more things we don't need. This shift, from accumulation to conservation, from social performance to authentic expression, reflected a fundamental realignment of values I had never expected to witness in the status-conscious couple I had known just months earlier. The most significant milestone in our evolving relationship came unexpectedly during a thunderstorm at the farm. William and I had been working on repairing a section of the barn roof when the sky darkened prematurely. We barely made it inside before rain began pounding against the windows, thunder echoing across the countryside. As we sat on the covered porch watching lightning illuminate the orchards, William turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen since. He was a child, vulnerable, seeking guidance rather than projecting certainty. "Mom, I need your advice about something important," he began, his voice barely audible above the storm. "It's about my career." For years, William had never sought my input on professional matters, assuming his corporate path was beyond my understanding or expertise. That he was now actively seeking my perspective represented a seismic shift in how he perceived my wisdom and experience. "I've been offered a partnership track position at Harrington Development," he explained, referring to his father-in-law's company. "More money, more prestige, more of what I've been working toward for years." "That sounds like wonderful recognition," I offered cautiously, hearing hesitation in his tone. "It would be, except—" He paused, struggling to articulate something. "The role would require me to focus primarily on developing luxury properties on agricultural land outside Chicago, converting working farms into high-end residential communities." The implications were immediately clear. "Like this farm," I observed quietly. "Exactly," William confirmed, his discomfort evident. 3 months ago, I would have seen it as a perfect, strategic advancement. Now I'm questioning whether building my career on transforming properties like this into luxury developments would ultimately undermine the values I'm just starting to reconnect with. The insight reflected remarkable self-awareness, recognition that professional advancement might come at the cost of personal integrity. It was a nuanced calculation I wouldn't have believed William capable of making before our recent reconciliation. "What alternatives are you considering?" I asked, curious about how he was approaching this crossroads. "That's where I'd value your perspective," he replied. "Mapleton Agricultural Heritage Foundation is looking for a development director, someone with financial expertise to help preserve working farms through conservation easements and sustainable business models. The compensation is lower, the path less certain, but something about it feels more aligned with Dad's values, with the legacy he tried to build here." The choice he was describing, between status and authenticity, between Gerald Harrington's world and values more aligned with James's, seemed to encapsulate the fundamental crossroads he had reached in his personal development. "What would you do?" he asked directly, lightning illuminating his face in brief flashes that revealed his genuine uncertainty. I considered my response carefully, recognizing the significance of being asked for guidance after years of dismissal. "I can't tell you which path to choose," I said finally. "But I can share what I've learned from 30 years of maintaining this farm, while living a life that many, including your father-in-law, might consider modest and unambitious." William leaned forward, listening with an openness I had rarely seen in our adult relationship. "True wealth isn't measured by what you display to others, but by what you preserve for yourself and future generations," I continued. "I chose to be wealthy in things that couldn't be taken away: knowledge, integrity, purpose, authentic relationships. That choice meant driving older cars and living in a smaller house, but it also meant never compromising my values for status or approval." Thunder rumbled as my words hung between us, the storm outside echoing the emotional turbulence of the choices he faced. "I think I've been chasing the wrong kind of success," William said finally, "measuring my worth by metrics that never quite satisfied something deeper in me." 2 days later, he called to tell me he had accepted the position with the Mapleton Agricultural Heritage Foundation, declining the more prestigious role with his father-in-law's company. Gerald Harrington's disappointment had been palpable, but William had maintained his decision with a quiet confidence that reminded me of James's steadfast nature. The anniversary celebration dawned with perfect September weather, golden light, filtering through the apple trees, the orchard heavy with ripening fruit. the air carrying the first hint of autumn crispness. We had spent the previous week preparing the farm, string lights hung in the trees, simple wooden tables arranged beneath the ancient oaks, wildflowers from the meadow gathered in mason jars as centerpieces. As I helped Diane with final preparations, in the farmhouse kitchen, she turned to me with unexpected emotion. "I need to thank you, Margaret," she said, her eyes meeting mine as she arranged locally sourced cheeses on a wooden board James had carved decades earlier. "Not just for the farm, but for preserving values that William and I almost lost completely." "You recognize their worth when given the chance to see them," I replied, touched by her sincerity. "That speaks to something authentic in you that was perhaps waiting for permission to emerge." She smiled, a genuine expression so different from the calculated charm I had first encountered years ago. "My mother arrived earlier than expected," she continued. "I found her sitting on the porch alone, crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said they weren't tears of sadness but of recognition, that this place made her remember values her own parents had held before social climbing became their priority." This ripple effect, how the authenticity of the farm seemed to awaken forgotten priorities even in the most status-conscious guests, continued throughout the day. Gerald Harrington arrived looking uncomfortable in his casual attire, his usual, commanding presence diminished by surroundings that valued substance over appearance. Yet by evening, even he seemed softened by the genuine joy evident in the celebration, his practiced networking smile occasionally giving way to moments of what looked like genuine reflection. The ceremony itself was simple, but profound. William and Diane stood beneath the ancient oak tree where James and I had been married nearly 50 years earlier, renewing their vows before a small gathering of family and close friends. Rather than the scripted, professionally photographed performance their original plans had envisioned, they spoke from the heart about building a marriage based on authentic connection rather than social expectation. As golden light bathed the gathering, William surprised me by adding an unplanned element to the ceremony. After they had exchanged their renewed promises, he asked everyone to remain seated, then turned to address the small gathering. "Today isn't just about celebrating our past 25 years or looking forward to the next chapter," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "It's about honoring legacies that almost slipped away." He turned toward me, seated in the front row. "Mom, would you join us?" Confused but curious, I made my way to where they stood beneath the oak tree. William took my hand and Diane's, creating a circle among the three of us. "Many of you don't know the full story of this farm," he began, addressing the guests but looking at me. "For 30 years, my mother preserved this place, not just the buildings and orchards, but the values they represent, while letting everyone, including me, believe it had been sold after my father's death. She maintained it quietly, without recognition, because she understood that some legacies are worth protecting at any cost." Murmurs moved through the small gathering as people began to understand the significance of what he was sharing. "When Diane and I chose to celebrate our anniversary here, it wasn't just because of the beautiful setting," he continued. "It was because we wanted to mark this milestone in a place built with intention and maintained with devotion, qualities we hope will characterize the next chapter of our life together." William reached into his pocket and withdrew a document I immediately recognized as the trust amendment I had signed in Ed Porter's office. "Mom, in front of these witnesses, I want to give you this," he said, handing me the document. "It's a new trust amendment I've had prepared. It doesn't restore me as beneficiary of the farm. Instead, it creates a family stewardship arrangement where the property remains under your control during your lifetime, then passes to a multi-generational trust that ensures it will never be developed or fundamentally altered from Dad's vision." The thoughtfulness of this arrangement, acknowledging my right to control what I had preserved while ensuring its protection beyond any individual lifetime, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I don't want to own this farm," William continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "I want to be worthy of helping steward it. of continuing the legacy of care you've maintained for decades. In that moment, standing beneath the oak tree where James and I had exchanged vows nearly 50 years earlier, I felt the completion of a circle that had begun 30 years before when I had created the trust to protect our family legacy from being dismantled. What had begun as a defensive measure had evolved into something far more meaningful, a multi-generational commitment to values worth preserving. The celebration continued into evening, lanterns glowing in the orchard trees. Simple but delicious food served family-style at long tables set on the lawn. I found myself in conversations with people from William and Diane's lives who seemed genuinely interested in understanding the farm's history and significance, a sharp contrast to the networking-focused interactions I had anticipated from their social circle. As night fell and stars appeared above the orchard, I slipped away from the celebration to sit briefly at the edge of the apple trees, absorbing the magnitude of the day's events. The couple dancing beneath string lights on the lawn were nearly unrecognizable from the status-conscious pair who had excluded me from their anniversary plans just months earlier. The transformation in our relationships, from dismissal to recognition, from exclusion to central importance, seemed almost too profound to absorb in a single evening. Ed Porter joined me at the orchard's edge, his expression reflecting similar thoughts. "When you signed that trust amendment in my office," he observed quietly, "did you ever imagine it would lead to this outcome?" "Never," I admitted, watching the celebration unfold against the backdrop of the farmhouse James had loved. I thought I was protecting a physical legacy. I never imagined I was actually creating the catalyst for something much more valuable. "Recognition," Ed supplied, echoing the word I had used months earlier when describing what I truly wanted from William. Not just of your legal right to the property, but of your existence as a complete person with your own story. "Yes," I agreed, watching my son and his wife move among their guests with a groundedness I had never before observed in them. And perhaps recognition of values that both of them needed, but had forgotten how to prioritize. As I rejoined the celebration, William approached with 2 glasses of apple cider pressed from the orchard's fruit, handing one to me. "I've been thinking about something Dad apparently told you," he said. "About appearances being deceiving, but ownership being truth." I nodded, wondering where his thoughts were leading. "I think I finally understand what he meant," William continued. "Not legal ownership of property, but owning your choices, your values, your authentic path, rather than one dictated by others' expectations." He raised his glass slightly. "To owning truth rather than maintaining appearances." The simple toast encapsulated the profound transformation of recent months, from a relationship built on misconceptions and dismissal to one founded on genuine recognition and shared values. Later that evening, as guests began to depart and the celebration quieted, I found myself alone in the farmhouse kitchen, washing dishes alongside Eleanor Harrington, Diane's mother. A woman who had initially intimidated me with her polished society manner, but who had shown unexpected depth throughout the day. "You created something remarkable here," she said quietly, her hands immersed in soapy water beside mine. "Not just the beautiful setting, but the values it represents. Values I had almost forgotten were important." "The farm did that," I replied. "James's craftsmanship has a way of reminding people what matters." She shook her head slightly. "No, Margaret, you did that. By preserving this place when it would have been easier to let it go. By maintaining these values when the world increasingly dismissed them as outdated. By standing your ground when excluded from your son's celebration." She met my eyes directly. "That kind of quiet courage changes more than just your own story. It creates ripples that affect everyone around you." The following morning, as William and Diane prepared to leave for a brief honeymoon retreat at a nearby lake cabin, a far cry from the luxury European tour their original plans had included, I stood on the farmhouse porch watching the sun rise over the orchards. The dew-covered grass sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light, a reminder of the quiet beauty that had sustained me through decades of solitary stewardship. William approached, coffee mug in hand, to join me in this peaceful moment. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he asked, his gaze moving across the land his great-grandfather had first cultivated. All those years I was pursuing what I thought was success, climbing corporate ladders, accumulating status markers. You were here, quietly creating something of genuine value that will outlast all of that. His observation touched on the fundamental difference in our life paths that had finally begun to reconnect after decades of divergence. "Different kinds of wealth," I suggested. "One visible but often hollow, the other quieter but more enduring." William nodded thoughtfully. Dad understood that. I think part of me always knew it too. But I got distracted by shiny things along the way. As they prepared to leave, William surprised me with a genuine embrace. Not the perfunctory gesture our physical interactions had become over the years, but a connection that acknowledged our shared journey. "Thank you, Mom," he said simply. "Not just for the farm, but for being patient enough to wait for me to remember what matters." Diane joined us, her hand resting lightly on William's shoulder. "We've been talking," she said, her expression suggesting this was something they had considered carefully. "James and Elizabeth have been asking to spend more time with their grandmother. We thought perhaps they could stay with you here at the farm for part of their summer break, learn some of the things William is just now discovering." The suggestion that their children, my grandchildren who had been raised with carefully scheduled enrichment activities and limited time for exploration, might experience the farm's rhythms and lessons created a surge of emotion I hadn't expected. "I would love that," I managed, picturing young James climbing the same apple trees his grandfather had scaled as a boy, Elizabeth discovering the simple joy of gathering eggs from the small henhouse we maintained behind the barn. "They need what this place teaches," William added, his gaze moving across the farm with new appreciation. "What you teach, the values of patience, stewardship, finding beauty in the authentic rather than the artificial." As they drove away, I stood on the porch watching their car disappear down the gravel drive, marveling at how completely our relationships had transformed in the span of a few months. What had begun with the painful discovery of my exclusion, from their celebration, had evolved into something I had almost stopped hoping for. Genuine recognition of my worth beyond the limited role I had been assigned in their narrative. The farm that had remained my secret sanctuary for 30 years had emerged from the shadows to become something more significant, a physical reminder of values worth preserving across generations. My son, who had dismissed me as financially naive and limited, had discovered not only my capabilities but wisdom he now actively sought. His wife, whom I had misjudged as superficially status-conscious, had revealed depths of perception and courage I hadn't imagined possible. Even Gerald and Eleanor Harrington, though still firmly anchored in their world of social positioning, had been forced to recognize dimensions of fulfillment their wealth and connections couldn't provide. The property they had initially dismissed as charmingly rustic, but ultimately outdated, had become the setting for their daughter's anniversary celebration, a tangible repudiation of the values hierarchy they had constructed. As I walked through the quiet farmhouse that afternoon, touching objects James had crafted with his hands, the oak banister he had carved with intricate apple blossom patterns, the kitchen cabinets he had built from cherry trees harvested on our own land, I felt a sense of completion that transcended the specific outcomes of recent months. The farm I had preserved through decades of quiet determination had ultimately preserved something in all of us. A recognition of what endures when appearances fade and strategic advantages lose their relevance. My son's wife had told me I couldn't attend their anniversary party, so I canceled something they never expected. In doing so, I hadn't just protected a physical legacy, but had catalyzed a transformation in multiple lives, including my own. What had begun as a defensive revelation had evolved into an affirmative statement of values worth preserving, not just in buildings and orchards, but in the relationships and choices that ultimately define who we are and what we leave behind. As James had told William so many years ago while teaching him to prune the heritage apple trees, remember, appearance changes with seasons, but roots determine what endures. After 30 years of tending those roots in solitude, I was no longer alone in understanding their importance. 6 months after William and Diane's anniversary celebration at the farm, the first hints of spring were beginning to soften the winter landscape. Tender buds appeared on the apple trees, and birdsong once again filled the early morning hours, as I sat on the farmhouse porch with my coffee, watching sunrise paint the orchards in gentle pinks and golds. The sound of tires on gravel broke the morning stillness. William's car appeared around the bend in the drive, unusually early for their now regular weekend visits. I watched with curiosity as he parked and approached the porch alone, carrying what appeared to be an old leather portfolio I hadn't seen in decades. "Morning, Mom," he called, climbing the steps to join me. "Hope it's not too early." "Never too early," I replied, pouring him coffee from the thermos I kept ready for our morning conversations. "Everything all right?" William settled into the rocking chair beside mine, the portfolio balanced carefully on his knees. "More than all right, actually. I found something yesterday that I wanted to share with you right away." He opened the worn leather case and extracted what I immediately recognized as James's original farm journals, the meticulous records my husband had kept of plantings and harvests, weather patterns and soil amendments, successes and failures in the orchards. For 30 years, these journals had been packed away in storage, presumed unimportant or lost entirely. "Where did you find these?" I asked, running my fingers over James's familiar handwriting on the cover of the oldest volume, dated 1972, the year we had taken over management of the farm from his father. "In the attic storage at Diane's parents' house," William explained. "Apparently, after Dad died, some boxes of his personal effects were sent there during the move to your apartment. They've been sitting untouched all these years." The revelation that these precious records, the documentation of James's careful stewardship, had been sitting forgotten in the Harringtons' climate-controlled storage space for 3 decades, struck me as a perfect metaphor for how his values had been preserved but ignored, waiting to be rediscovered when the time was right. "I spent half the night reading through them," William admitted, his expression reflective. "Dad's voice comes through so clearly in these pages, his patience, his attention to detail, his deep understanding of the land's cycles." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded photograph. It showed James and 7-year-old William inspecting apple blossoms, their heads bent together in matching poses of concentration. "I remember this day," William said softly. "Dad was teaching me how to predict the harvest by examining the spring blooms. He said you could see the future if you knew how to read the signs nature provides." The memory created a moment of connection. Across time, James's wisdom reaching forward to touch our son decades after his passing. What struck me most was how completely William had forgotten these lessons until recently, how thoroughly they had been buried beneath the values of a world that measured success in quarterly earnings rather than generational thinking. "There's something specific I wanted to show you," William continued, turning carefully to a page near the back of the oldest journal. "I found this last night, and it changed everything." He handed me the open journal, pointing to an entry, dated just 3 weeks before James's diagnosis. The familiar handwriting filled the page with observations about that season's harvest. But at the bottom, a separate paragraph stood apart, written in a more personal tone. "I've been watching William as he prepares to leave for college. He's eager to explore a world beyond these orchards, and that's as it should be. But I worry that the values I've tried to instill, patience, stewardship, finding meaning in care rather than acquisition, may not take root in the soil of the world he's entering. Maggie understands, as she always does. Yesterday, walking the North Orchard, she said something I won't forget. Some seeds lie dormant until conditions are right for germination. We plant them anyway, trusting the season for growth will eventually come. Her wisdom gives me hope that even if William strays from these values in his journey, they remain within him, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Reading James's words, his concerns about our son's path and his faith in the eventual return to deeper values, brought tears to my eyes. Without knowing the challenges that lay ahead, James had anticipated both William's divergence from his teachings and the possibility of his eventual return. "Mom," William said quietly as I finished reading. "Dad knew. He understood I might lose my way, but believed I would find it again. And he recognized your wisdom, the same quiet foresight that led you to preserve this farm when everyone, including me, thought it should be sold or developed." He took the journal back gently, closing it with care before continuing. "I've been thinking about the decision I made last fall to join the Agricultural Heritage Foundation instead of taking the position with Diane's father's company. At the time, it felt like a risky choice, stepping away from the corporate path I'd followed for decades, but these past 6 months have been the most fulfilling of my professional life. The transformation in William since making that decision had been remarkable to witness. Though his new position came with a significant reduction in salary, the growing animation in his eyes when he discussed projects to help struggling family farms develop sustainable business models spoke to a satisfaction that no corporate bonus had ever provided. "The foundation is launching a new initiative," he explained, setting the journals aside to focus on our conversation. "We're creating an agricultural mentorship program that pairs experienced farmers with young people interested in sustainable farming but lacking land or knowledge. We're calling it the Heritage Stewardship Project." I smiled at the enthusiasm in his voice. "That sounds like something your father would have loved." "That's actually why I'm here so early," William continued. "The board is meeting next week to finalize the program structure, and they've asked me to present a potential location for the pilot project, somewhere that embodies the values the program hopes to instill." The direction of the conversation suddenly became clear. "You're thinking of the farm," I observed. William nodded, watching my reaction carefully. "Not as a donation or transfer of ownership. The farm remains exactly as we established in the new trust arrangement, but as a working classroom of sorts, where mentees could experience firsthand what multi-generational stewardship looks like in practice. The idea of the farm serving as a teaching space, a living embodiment of the values James had practiced and I had preserved, created a surge of emotion I hadn't anticipated. For 30 years, I had maintained this place alone, its meanings, and methods known only to me. The thought of sharing that knowledge with young people who might carry it forward into future generations felt like the completion of a circle James had begun drawing decades ago. "I think it's perfect," I said simply. "Your father always said knowledge not shared dies with the holder." William's relief was evident. "I hoped you'd feel that way. There's one more element to the proposal. The program needs a master steward, someone who can teach not just the practical skills of farming, but the philosophical underpinnings of true stewardship." He met my eyes directly. "The board would like that person to be you, Mom." The offer caught me by surprise. At 75, I had imagined my role increasingly becoming one of observation rather than active participation. The idea that my decades of quiet preservation might now be recognized as expertise worth sharing with a younger generation had never occurred to me. "Me?" I asked, genuinely startled. "William, there are professional farmers with advanced degrees who would be better qualified." He shook his head firmly. "That's exactly what the board doesn't want. They can hire agricultural scientists for the technical aspects. What they need, what these young people need, is someone who understands the soul of stewardship, who has lived it when it wasn't fashionable or profitable. His expression softened. Someone who preserved something precious when everyone else would have discarded it for quick gain. That's the heart of what this program aims to teach, and no one embodies that better than you. The validation of my life's quiet work, not just from my son but from professionals who recognized its value, felt like a gift I had never expected to receive. For decades, my careful stewardship had been dismissed as sentimental attachment to an outdated way of life. Now, as the world began to recognize the wisdom in sustainable practices and multi-generational thinking, what I had preserved was being recognized not as nostalgia, but as foresight. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. "It's a significant commitment at my age." William nodded understanding. "Of course. There's no rush for an answer." He glanced at his watch reluctantly. "I should get back to the city. I have a foundation meeting at 11. But Diane and I will be out tomorrow with the kids for our regular weekend visit." As he gathered the journals to leave, he paused, looking out over the orchards now fully illuminated in morning light. "You know what keeps striking me, Mom? For 30 years, you maintained this place without recognition or credit, simply because you believed it mattered. Now it turns out you were ahead of your time, that what seemed like stubborn preservation was actually visionary stewardship." After William left, I spent the morning walking the farm, considering his unexpected proposal. The idea of sharing what I had learned through decades of quiet care, not just the practical knowledge but the deeper values that had guided my stewardship, created a sense of purpose I hadn't anticipated at this stage of life. By the time I returned to the farmhouse, I had made my decision. The Heritage Stewardship Project would have its master steward, passing on not just techniques, but a philosophy of care that connected past to future through meaningful present action. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Eleanor Harrington, Diane's mother. Our relationship had evolved considerably since the anniversary celebration, moving from polite distance to something approaching genuine connection. "Margaret," she began without preamble, "I've been thinking about something you said when I helped with dishes after William and Diane's celebration, about how your husband believed that caring for something across generations taught patience and perspective that couldn't be learned any other way." "I remember," I confirmed, curious about the purpose of her call. "Well," she continued, a hint of nervousness in her voice, "Gerald and I have been discussing changes to our estate planning. We've always assumed the children would want to liquidate most of our properties after we're gone, converting them to financial assets. But after seeing what you've preserved at the farm, how it's influenced William and Diane," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "There's a property in Vermont. Nothing grand, just a simple lakeside cabin that's been in my family for generations. My grandparents built it, and it's the one place where social positioning never mattered. We've barely used it in recent years, and I assumed the children would sell it eventually." The parallel to the farm was unmistakable. Another property, valued for its authenticity rather than its market worth. "I'd like to establish something similar to what you've created with the Farm Trust," Eleanor continued. "A way to preserve it not just as property, but as a repository of family values that might otherwise be lost. Would you be willing to talk me through how you structured the arrangement? Perhaps you could visit the cabin with me next month." The invitation represented a remarkable evolution in our relationship. From the woman who had tacitly approved my exclusion from her daughter's celebration to someone seeking my guidance on preserving what truly mattered in her own family legacy. "I'd be honored," I replied sincerely. The following day brought William and Diane's regular weekend visit, this time with 14-year-old James and 12-year-old Elizabeth in tow. The transformation in these visits over the past 6 months had been remarkable to witness. What had begun as awkward obligations had evolved into eagerly anticipated gatherings where each family member connected with the farm and each other in increasingly meaningful ways. Young James, initially reluctant to separate from his electronic devices, had discovered an unexpected affinity for working with his hands. Under my guidance, he was slowly restoring an antique apple press his grandfather had used, his initial frustration with the process gradually giving way to the satisfaction of tangible accomplishment. Elizabeth, quiet and observant, had developed a passion for the heritage apple varieties, meticulously documenting their characteristics and histories in a journal that echoed her grandfather's careful records. Today, she arrived carrying a carefully wrapped package, her expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Grandma," she said as we settled on the porch after lunch, "I made something for you. For the farm, really." She handed me the package, watching intently as I unwrapped a beautifully crafted wooden sign. Carved and painted with remarkable skill for a 12-year-old, it read, "Collins Heritage Farm, Esther 1928, with delicate apple blossoms decorating the borders." "Dad helped a little with the wood burning," she admitted, "but I designed it and did most of the work? I thought we could hang it at the entrance to the drive." The thoughtfulness of the gift, a public declaration of the farm's identity and history, touched me deeply. For decades, the property had existed in a kind of limbo, its ownership uncertain, its purpose questioned. Now, Elizabeth was literally putting its name and legacy on display, recognizing its significance in our family story. "It's perfect," I told her, watching her face light up with pride. "We'll hang it this afternoon." As William helped Elizabeth mount her sign on posts at the farm's entrance, Diane joined me in the kitchen, where I was preparing apples for a pie using a recipe James's mother had taught me decades earlier. "I wanted to tell you something before we make a formal announcement," Diane said, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "William and I are looking at houses in Mapleton. Nothing grand, just a simple place that would allow us to be closer to the farm. He'll commute to the foundation offices when needed, and I'm exploring teaching positions at the community college." The news that they were considering relocating from their prestigious Chicago address to our small rural community represented perhaps the most dramatic evidence yet of their shifting values. "Are you sure about such a significant change?" I asked, genuinely concerned that they might be acting impulsively. Diane smiled with a self-awareness that reflected her personal growth over recent months. 6 months ago, I would have considered moving from our penthouse to a small-town home an unbearable step backward. Now it feels like moving forward into something more authentic. She began slicing apples alongside me, our hands working in companionable rhythm. The strangest part is my mother's reaction. Instead of the horror I expected, she's been supportive. Said something about understanding what we're seeking only now, after a lifetime of chasing the wrong indicators of success. By late afternoon, the four of them were preparing to return to the city when William pulled me aside, gesturing toward the newly installed sign now proudly marking the farm's entrance. "Have you thought about the Heritage Stewardship Project?" he asked. "The board meets Tuesday, and I'd like to include your decision in my presentation if you've made one." Looking at the sign, at the name and date proclaiming a legacy that had almost been lost, my resolve solidified. "Tell them yes," I said simply. "It's time to share what I've learned." William's expression reflected genuine pride, not the superficial recognition of status he had once valued, but a deeper appreciation of character and commitment. "They'll be thrilled," he said. "So am I." As they prepared to leave, I was struck by how completely our family dynamics had transformed in less than a year. The son who had once excluded me from his celebration now sought my wisdom and guidance. The daughter-in-law who had viewed me as an embarrassing reminder of William's humble origins now valued the very authenticity she had once dismissed. The grandchildren who had been raised with carefully curated experiences were discovering the satisfaction of meaningful work and connection to place. Most significantly, I had evolved from a woman fighting for recognition to one secure in her worth and wisdom, not defined by others' perceptions, but by the values I had maintained through decades of quiet perseverance. Later that evening, as spring twilight settled over the orchards, I sat on the porch swing James had built during our first year of marriage. The farm spread before me, illuminated in the gentle glow of sunset. The weathered red barn, the heritage apple trees beginning their annual cycle of renewal. The fields where 4 generations of Collins men had worked the land with reverence and care. For 30 years, I had preserved this place alone, motivated by a promise to James and a belief in values that seemed increasingly outdated in a world that prioritized novelty over durability, appearance over substance. What had begun as a defensive measure, protecting the farm from being sold or developed, had evolved into something far more significant: the physical embodiment of an alternative way of measuring what matters. My phone chimed with a message from William. Board presentation prepared for Tuesday. Farm will be perfect teaching space for what truly matters. Thank you for showing us the way home. The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to my eyes. When I had revealed the truth about the farm's ownership, a truth protected for 3 decades, I had acted from a place of self-defense, responding to the pain of exclusion from a family milestone. What I couldn't have anticipated was how that revelation would catalyze such profound transformation, not just in William and Diane, but in an expanding circle that now included the Harringtons, and would soon extend to young people seeking to learn the art of stewardship. The ringing of my phone interrupted these reflections. It was Ed Porter, now 82 but still sharp as ever. "Margaret," he greeted me warmly. "I've just finished reviewing the final documents for the Heritage Stewardship Project. Everything's in order for William's presentation on Tuesday." "Thanky." "You, Ed?" I replied. "For this and for everything over the past 30 years. None of this would have been possible without your help maintaining the trust arrangement James established." "I was thinking about James today," Ed continued, his voice softening with memory. "About the conversation we had just before he finalized the trust documents. He said something I've never forgotten, that he was protecting the farm not from William but for him, creating space for his son to eventually find his way back to values that would sustain him more truly than corporate success ever could. The insight was so perfectly aligned with the journal entry William had discovered that it created a sense of James's presence, his foresight spanning decades to guide our family toward reconciliation. Neither of us had imagined possible during those difficult final days. "James would be proud," Ed added quietly, "not just of how you preserved the farm, but of how you used that preservation to heal what was broken between you and William." After we said our goodbyes, I remained on the porch as full darkness settled over the farm. Stars appeared above the orchards, the same constellations that had guided James's grandfather when he first planted these trees, that would still shine over whatever grew here centuries after we were gone. I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment of harmony and recognition. The pain of being excluded from William and Diane's celebration had been genuine, a culmination of decades of being underestimated and dismissed. The decision to reveal the truth about the farm's ownership had been born partly from that pain, a determination to be seen and valued for who I truly was, rather than the convenient character others had constructed. Yet what had begun as self-assertion had evolved into something far more profound, a catalyst for healing and reconnection that extended beyond my relationship with William to touch everyone around us. The farm that James had loved, that generations of Collins men had tended with reverence and care, had become not just preserved heritage, but living teacher, helping each of us recognize what truly mattered before it was too late. 3 days later, the board of the Agricultural Heritage Foundation unanimously approved the Heritage Stewardship Project, with the Collins farm designated as its centerpiece and me as its master steward. The first group of mentees would arrive. In early summer, young people seeking connection to sustainable practices and values in a world increasingly recognizing the limitations of disposable culture. William called with the news, his voice carrying a satisfaction I had never heard. During his corporate successes, they were particularly moved by the story of how the farm was preserved, he explained. Not just the practical aspects, but the underlying philosophy, the belief that some things deserve protection simply because they represent values worth maintaining. It seems your father's wisdom is finding new audiences, I observed, picturing James's pleasure at this unexpected outcome. There's something else, William continued. Diane and I have made an offer on a house just 3 miles from the farm. If all goes well, we'll be moved in by midsummer. The news that they were actually proceeding with relocation to Mapleton confirmed how completely their priorities had shifted. From a prestigious Chicago address to a small rural community represented not a step down, but a step toward authenticity they had been missing. The children are thrilled, William added. James is already talking about expanding the heritage, orchard varieties, and Elizabeth wants to create educational materials for the mentorship program. As spring progressed into early summer, the farm took on new energy as preparations for the Heritage Stewardship Project transformed spaces that had been frozen in memory into active teaching environments. The weathered toolshed became a classroom for hands-on demonstrations. The summer kitchen, unused for decades, was restored to demonstrate food preservation techniques. The apple press young James had restored was moved to a prominent position for harvest demonstrations. Most significantly, James's farm journals, recently recovered from the Harrington storage, were carefully digitized, preserving his wisdom for future stewards, while allowing the originals to be displayed in the farmhouse for mentees to study his methodical approach to sustainable agriculture. 1 week before the first mentees were scheduled to arrive, William, Diane, and the children helped me prepare the farmhouse for its new role as the center of the Heritage Stewardship Project. As we worked together, cleaning windows, arranging furniture, mounting educational displays about the farm's history, I was struck by how naturally they had become partners in preservation rather than agents of change. I've been thinking, William said as we took a break on the porch, watching young James and Elizabeth selecting spots for the beehives that would be part of the project's pollinator program. About the moment you revealed you still owned the farm. About the shock of discovering my mother had been executing a sophisticated preservation strategy for decades while I underestimated her capabilities. He shook his head slightly, the memory clearly still powerful. I was angry then, felt betrayed by the deception. Now I see it was the wake-up call I needed, the catalyst that forced me to recognize how completely I had misunderstood what matters. Diane joined us, wiping dust from her hands onto jeans that had replaced her once immaculate designer attire, a physical manifestation of her shifting priorities. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be happier helping restore an old farmhouse than hosting cocktail parties in our penthouse, I would have thought you were delusional, she admitted with a self-deprecating smile. Yet here we are, and I haven't felt this authentic in decades. The following weekend, 3 days before the official launch of the Heritage Stewardship Project, we gathered at the farm for a private family celebration. William and Diane had completed their move to Mapleton, settling into a modest farmhouse that bore no resemblance to their former luxury condominium, but seemed to fit them far more naturally. Gerald and Eleanor Harrington joined us, their evolution perhaps the most unexpected development of recent months. After my visit to their Vermont cabin, helping Eleanor establish a preservation trust similar to what protected the Collins farm, Gerald had become increasingly interested in the Heritage Stewardship Project, eventually offering to fund a scholarship program for mentees who couldn't afford the modest participation fee. Never thought I'd be investing in preserving family farms instead of developing them, he admitted, as we toured the educational spaces prepared for the incoming mentees. Spent my career turning agricultural land into luxury housing. Seems there's still time to balance that ledger somewhat. As evening approached, William gathered everyone on the farmhouse porch for what he described as a special announcement. The entire family assembled, me, the Harringtons, young James and Elizabeth, even Ed Porter, who had driven out from the city for the occasion. "Before we officially launch the Heritage Stewardship Project next week," William began, "there's something important we want to share." He nodded to Diane, who continued seamlessly, their partnership now reflecting genuine collaboration rather than strategic alliance. "When we were planning our anniversary celebration last year," she explained, "we originally created an event designed to impress people who had no genuine connection to our lives. In excluding Margaret, we prioritized appearance over authenticity, business strategy over family bonds." William picked up the narrative, his expression reflective. That decision, and Mom's response to it, became the catalyst for recognizing how far we had strayed from values that truly sustain meaningful lives. The past year has been a journey of rediscovery, of the farm, yes, but more importantly of what matters beyond status and acquisition. Young James stepped forward, surprising everyone by addressing the gathering with unexpected poise for a 14-year-old. "Dad and Mom asked me to help explain why this matters to my generation, too. Before we started coming to the farm regularly, I spent most of my time in structured activities designed to build my resume for future college applications." He glanced at his parents with a gentle acknowledgement of their former priorities. "Here, I've learned that some forms of knowledge can't be measured in grades or achievements, that understanding how to nurture something across seasons teaches patience and perspective I never gained from acceleration programs or competitive sports." Elizabeth joined her brother, the pair standing together in the golden evening light. "What we're trying to say is that Grandma's preservation of this farm didn't just save buildings and trees. It preserved a different way of understanding success and fulfillment that all of us needed to rediscover." William moved to stand beside me, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "Mom, when you revealed you still owned this farm after being told you weren't welcome at our anniversary celebration, you created the moment of truth our family needed. What began as painful confrontation has become precious restoration." Diane completed the circle, joining us with unexpected tears in her eyes. "So tonight, before the Heritage Stewardship Project officially begins sharing these lessons with others, we wanted to acknowledge the original steward, the woman who preserved not just property but values when everyone, including us, had forgotten their worth." Gerald Harrington stepped forward, surprising everyone by addressing me directly. "Margaret, as someone who spent decades misunderstanding what truly appreciates over time, I've watched this transformation in my daughter and son-in-law with both amazement and gratitude. You've shown us all that true wealth isn't what you display, but what you protect and nurture when no one else recognizes its value." As twilight settled over the farm that would soon welcome its first generation of new stewards, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with exclusion and revelation had culminated in recognition far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first signed the trust documents in Ed Porter's office 30 years earlier. What James had hoped to preserve, through that legal arrangement, wasn't just property, but perspective, a way of valuing sustainability over immediate gain, stewardship over ownership, substance over appearance. For decades, I had maintained the physical manifestation of those values alone, uncertain whether they would find resonance in future generations increasingly distant from agricultural heritage. Now, watching 4 generations gather on the farmhouse porch, from Gerald and Eleanor Harrington to young Elizabeth with her careful drawings of heritage apple varieties, I understood that what we had preserved together wasn't just buildings and orchards, but something far more precious. The recognition that some forms of wealth appreciate across generations, not through accumulation, but through protection of what truly matters. My son's wife had told me I couldn't attend their anniversary celebration, so I canceled something they never expected. In doing so, I hadn't just protected a physical legacy, but had catalyzed a transformation in all our lives, revealing that true value often lies hidden beneath appearances, waiting for the courage to prioritize substance over status, authenticity over advantage. As stars appeared above the ancient apple trees James's grandfather had planted, I thought of the journal entry William had discovered. James's faith that the values he had tried to instill would eventually re-emerge when the season was right. For their growth. Looking at our family gathered in the gentle evening light, I knew that season had finally arrived, not just for William, but for all of us who had learned to recognize the quiet wealth of stewardship over the hollow abundance of acquisition. The Heritage Stewardship Project would begin sharing these lessons beyond our family in just a few days. But the most important preservation had already been accomplished, not of property, but of perspective, not of buildings, but of the belief that what we nurture with patience and protect with perseverance creates value no balance sheet can measure but every heart can recognize.